what are feature flags? Effectively, there's a lot of complicated definitions out there. Some of them get into really complicated things, talking about toggles and the code aspects of it. But actually, the main kind of takeaway I would want you to think of is this, which is it's a strategy for decoupling feature deployments from code deployments. That might still be a bit too complicated in many ways, but what we're really thinking of is you want to be able to put code on your servers, but not have the features impact your customers immediately. Why would we want to actually decouple features from code? And our first point is really about just reducing the size of our changes. So if we're thinking maybe we've got quite a long project, you know, if you work in sprints, you might have like stuff that's going to go over several sprints. The tasks are small, so you want to have those small little changes go into your code base as soon as possible to help other developers pick up those changes. But then you start to run into that risk of how much kind of you start to put together into one branch. So if you've got like a develop branch, you want your feature to go into a branch and then go back to develop right away. I'm sure plenty of people have had this problem of where they start to end up putting lots of code into a new branch. That new branch has then got to go back into develop. But at this point, it might be about 2 months down the line, and you have to then start merging develop back into this other branch, and it all gets really messy really quickly, right? And you start asking, how are you going to review? Do you review it when it goes into this kind of staging branch, or do you start putting it, you know, review it when it's all done? So this other one is probably the best part about feature flags, in my opinion anyway. Taking the risk out of exposing new features to customers, because ultimately that's really risky when you're not sure how customers are potentially going to react to the feature even. So imagine you've got work that you've done and it's now been put onto your servers, but you want to hold back the actual feature from being deployed. A really good example of something like this is like obviously with Facebook, you know, back in about 2010, you would have situations where they would, you'd have customers complaining, people who are using the site, and they're saying along the lines of, oh, I don't want this thing to change, I don't like it, etc. Instead, what they've kind of actually adapted to do at that point is release it slowly to certain people and get feedback and start to work out when actually, you know, they've got the feature right. It's better to kind of bug fix to like a couple people rather than bug fixing to everyone at the point you've launched that feature. Think of right now Elon Musk and Twitter, a lot of people complaining about all these changes, very quick, very breaking, but actually if you're doing it behind feature flags, it's almost silent. You start to change it for the people who are just being affected. It's a good way of also potentially getting people to beta things. So go to your customers, say, hey, do you want to try this new thing? That way they're taking some of the risk and they know what they're taking. The other thing is testing the actual code in production. And that sounds like a really bad thing, right? But when we get to the point of maybe we can't test something in a staging environment, or we can't test it with actual test data properly. I'm facing this problem at the moment at Amiqus, one of our providers, very big government entity, doesn't have a sandbox environment. Their API that we're using only works with real people. So we have to go to a customer and say, will you be our little guinea pig for this so that we can test out Otherwise, it's a huge amount of risk. We don't want to let that loose. Support will hate us really if we're generating lots of bad feedback from all of our clients rather than just a couple. So if we're thinking about that last slide there of all these things we want to get out of it, what are the actual requirements of that solution with feature flagging? First is really we just want to help us deploy the code without deploying the feature. And that's a pretty simple target. The second one is to help us deploy the features to actual individual groups. Individuals or groups. So I'm thinking kind of users or teams. Most companies are usually working on some kind of entity type system like that. If we were to actually talk about the terminologies, the first point would be considered feature flagging, and the second point would actually be called dark launching, which is a bit of a vague term. It doesn't really mean anything, but that's kind of what the most popular term is. So this is where I get to have a quick break. But essentially, that's all the theory really I want to talk about, because we could go on forever talking about different terms and all these things. So kind of taking those requirements forward, we could start doing this with environment variables. It's quite easy to start feature flagging. As you can see, really simple code example. It's just an if statement. We're just going to go, if this environment variable exists, then we want to run this bit of code. And that's definitely going to help us with actually deploying our code without deploying the feature until it's ready. We just set the environment variable to true on our servers, and we're good to go. But this doesn't work very well for very long. It just doesn't scale well. And what I mean by that is we start to end up putting lots of environment variables that they're just booleans to say, is this on and is this off? And it definitely won't help with the fact that most environments are, well, most server setups are not actually going to have environment variables changing when the code's actually deployed. Most of the time, at least definitely something Amiqus does, we usually only change our environment variables when we're doing a deployment. So if those two things are coupled, then you're actually not deploying the features at the time that the code's on there. You're doing them at the same time. This also just really doesn't help us with the second requirement we had, which is we want to be able to deploy to individuals or groups. We can then start to go into using a database. It's a harder solution. The code doesn't really look too complicated, but the code underneath that's going to be a lot harder, because we're now doing things that are actually attaching flags to, in this case, a group, a team of users. This will help us deploy the code from the feature still, but it's also now going to give us the ability to deploy to individuals or groups. So that's pretty good, right? There's still problems though with databases. I think kind of the obvious one is you've now introduced lots of reads on your database. If you're going to hit the database every time you have something like maybe a twig or blade template, whatever framework of preference uses, then at that point you're constantly hitting your database. It's just lots of extra effort. We then also have this problem of it becomes quite complicated, like I mentioned about environment variables, and would you end up creating kind of an environment variable for every user or every team? You don't want to do that, but you still have to find a way to manage with a database how you're linking the state of that flag being on or off to a user or a team. So we can fix the first one, our issue of lots of reads, by implementing caching. The kind of forms of caching I'll go into in a moment, but that's your kind of best route for that. And honestly, if we're going to go down the route of trying to deploy to individuals or groups, we're going to want a UI for this. Especially bearing in mind, the good thing about this is that it's a very product approach. It's not just an engineering solution. If you build a UI that's really good, you can give it to people who are non-engineers, and they can then start to launch. A really good example is like a lot of marketing teams want to be able to launch code when they want to be able to launch it, not when an engineer has turned around and said, oh, we're okay to merge this branch now. I'm sure that's a situation a lot of people have been into, where you then start putting back, merging your code, because now marketing say, oh, we want to hold off because we're not ready. But then once marketing is ready, you have to turn around and go, sorry, someone merged something that's now made this merging even more complicated. So we're going to have to hold off. And it's this repetitive cycle of who gets to go first. So caching flags. First way is really just to do it once per request. Grab the flag you need and keep it somewhere in memory. Works pretty well for APIs. It's not going to be a problem, but it's not great if you've got a single page application that's running off those APIs, because one moment you might hit the API and it's absolutely fine. But the next moment you're hitting it again and you've got a completely different state. Your single page application is now going to have to keep working out those things or maintain its own state of what flags are enabled. The other idea is actually just do it once per session. So if you've got a normal web application, this is going to work really well for you. The slight downside, though, is that when you are doing that, you're going to want to tell people to have to log out to clear their session and then log back in, so the feature is actually now enabled for them. That can be a bit confusing in itself. People start seeing one screen in a team potentially, but another person is now seeing the old screen or the new screen, and now they've got something different between them. Another thing is actually just consider eager loading a lot of these things. So if you know what flags are going to be used when they hit a particular route within your application, start loading all those flags pretty much straight away at that route, and then allow the rest of the code to execute. What's the best way to create a UI for all this? The first thing is most apps probably have an administration area. If you've got that area, then it's not too hard to kind of tack it on and start adding maybe a page that manages all these different flags related to the team or related to the user that you've got. You still have to then come up with some quite complicated ways of if you want to mass enable flags, because chances are you're not going to have someone who goes in and to every single user possible and ticks a box that says they can now use this thing. That in itself can be quite a complicated process. It's also not a great idea to use an admin area because, well, if that's used by people who are not very techy or don't understand the product and features, then maybe your admin area is used for, I don't know, just simple service options. Then you start mixing product related things with your business logic. This is my preferred approach, which is actually to just build a dedicated dashboard for them. It sounds like a lot of work, and in all honesty, it is, but you are then building something of value into your product that you can give access to the right people who understand what they're enabling properly or what they're taking away from any users or teams. The other option is there are these external services you could use. I have played around with Unleashed a little, but I couldn't really say much about Launch Darkly and Flagsmith. I know Unleashed and Flagsmith are cloud options that are open source, so you could set up a server that runs their software, but especially an example like Unleashed, you end up having to have a database that's Postgres. So if you're not using Postgres, you're now hosting an extra database just to run this application. It's something really to consider. It's in your DevOps environment, whether you want to start maintaining another thing or go with their cloud options. But either way, it becomes a bit difficult because actually you're not going to be using your database and you're not building into your application code much other than a system that contacts an external service. To me, that doesn't feel like a great way to do feature flags. I'm sure if you're a really big company environment, maybe there's a reason that works better for you. But if you're still quite a small SaaS startup or something, then it's not a great way to go. Isn't there a package for all this? Well, you kind of know the answer because I've already talked about one I maintain. But for Laravel, there's the one I maintain. There is also just been announced recently the Laravel Pennant package. That's a first-party official one from Laravel. There's quite a different approach in that package to my package, and that's something you'd notice if you start to look at a lot of these different ones. They're all similar, but they're all distinctly different as well. So it can be quite hard to start making those decisions about what you want to use. Feature flags for Laravel, I designed it very much with the idea that you could really put anything behind it and it works pretty nicely. Laravel Pennant at the moment accepts just kind of in memory or using the database, which is for most people is enough. But if you do want to start coming up with more complicated processes, I do think Laravel Pennant might have some problems in the future. It really depends. That's some of the difficulty with these kind of decisions you have to make. For PHP in general, because I'm not sure how many people here are Laravel developers, there is a package called Flagception. I'm not really too well into the details of this one. There is a Symfony bundle for it. So if you're using Symfony, that should be quite easy to start maintaining into your own application. One of the difficulties with this kind of package, though, is, again, sorry. One of the kind of hard points with choosing these packages, again, is do you know what you're actually going to need? The Flagception one looks okay, but I couldn't really say either way. One of the problems is either way, no matter what you chose out of all of these, none of them are going to give you a UI. So again, you're kind of back to that previous decision of, well, you could skip all of that and use an external service. I personally would say it's a bit of a difficult one. And either way, you're going to have to spend that time and decide how you're going to interact. What is Flagfox? This is a project I started with a colleague kind of in December last year. So it's still very early on. It's a purpose-built UI for feature flags. Downside is it is solely for Laravel. The plan is to build it on top of the work I've already done in my own open source work. The cool thing, though, is it is just a package you install into your project. Gives you a lot more control. And there's definitely no cloud component, so you're not worrying about contacting or dealing with extra services. So often this gets kind of asked about when it comes to feature flagging. I've already mentioned the terms feature flags and dark launching, but we then get into this idea of A/B testing. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to talk about it much. I'll basically say everything I've talked about before this is 90% there. A/B testing really just requires you to start building an analytics system on top of what you've already built for feature flags and dark launching. Once you've got to that point, it's just maybe you could use Google Analytics or something along those lines and start sending event data, but with the context of which groups or which features have been enabled. So in summary, what I'd like you to take away really is flags do solve tangible problems, very useful to you. We found it at Amiqus far easier to work with flags in place and do our projects that way, because most of the things we're doing are not simple little button changes. There's real issues of how do we maintain. The databases are probably the best place to start. If you're going to start doing it, it makes sense to just start storing it against a user or a group rather than trying to play around with environment variables. I think most of the time you are going to end up just struggling and going, I'd rather use a database. When you're doing any of this stuff, it's best to ask yourself, does this actually decouple feature deployments from code? If it isn't, then ultimately I think you're probably going to a point of somewhere wrong. Basically, you're going down the wrong path. So keep asking yourself that question. Implementing feature flags is actually just mostly boilerplate. Most of the time it is as simple as having one function that says, is this enabled or not? The complicated stuff happens beneath that. So best to consider using a package, in my opinion. You're going to get a fair lot further rather than trying to implement something really complicated yourself. The best part is really to think about more about the UI considerations. These are just some links here I've got 2 articles already about this, which you can read if you're looking at Laravel. If you want to look at how to implement the package that I've already created, there's quite a handy guide there that just shows you how to use a database with it. And equally, that's the link there for the package itself. Thank you for listening.